The Soviet Union was a massive country. It existed for most of the 20th century. It had a huge impact on the world. From 1917 to 1991, it represented a challenge to the West. The Soviet Union promoted a communist ideology. This ideology differed greatly from capitalism. It called for a society without social classes. The Soviet Union's influence was far-reaching. It backed communist revolutions and governments. This happened in various parts of the world. Countries like Cuba and Vietnam were examples. The competition between the Soviet Union and the United States defined the Cold War. This rivalry had a profound effect on global politics. The Soviet experiment ultimately failed. It collapsed in 1991. However, its legacy continues to shape the world. The rise and fall of the Soviet Union offer important lessons. We can learn about ideology, power, and the complexities of social change. The Soviet Union's story is full of drama and upheaval. It was a time of revolution, war, and political repression. But it was also a time of incredible scientific achievement. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik. It also sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. These achievements shocked the United States. In the early 1900s, Russia was a land of deep unrest. The people suffered under the rule of the Tsar. He was an absolute monarch. Many Russians longed for change. World War I made things worse. Russia suffered heavy losses in the war. This brought the Tsar's government to the brink. In 1917, revolution erupted in Russia. The Tsar was overthrown. A new government took its place. It was called the Provisional Government. However, it was weak and indecisive. It failed to address the concerns of the people. This created an opportunity for a more radical group. They were the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a charismatic revolutionary. He had a clear vision for Russia. He wanted to create a socialist state. He believed in a system where workers controlled the means of production. Lenin promised peace, land, and bread to the Russian people. These promises resonated with the masses. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. This event became known as the October Revolution. It marked the beginning of the Soviet Union. Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced enormous challenges. They had to rebuild a country ravaged by war and revolution. The Bolshevik takeover did not bring peace to Russia. Instead, it ignited a brutal civil war. The Bolsheviks, now known as the Reds, faced opposition from many sides. Their opponents included monarchists, liberals, and other socialist groups. These groups became known as the Whites. The Russian Civil War was a long and bloody conflict. It lasted from 1918 to 1922. The Reds ultimately emerged victorious. They benefited from strong leadership and a united ideology. The Whites, on the other hand, were divided in their aims and lacked a cohesive strategy. Following the Civil War, Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced the daunting task of rebuilding the shattered nation. They implemented a series of radical economic and social reforms. These reforms were designed to create a socialist society. One of the most significant changes was the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, in 1922. The USSR was a federal union of several Soviet republics. It was based on the principle of a centralized government. The Bolshevik Party held absolute power. The formation of the USSR marked a new chapter in Russian history. It signaled the emergence of a new world power. The Soviet Union was ready to challenge the existing world order. Section 4. Stalin's Iron Grip, Industrialization, Terror, and Transformation. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle erupted within the Bolshevik Party. Joseph Stalin, a ruthless and ambitious figure, emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin consolidated his power through a series of purges. He eliminated his rivals and critics within the party. Stalin embarked on an ambitious program of rapid industrialization and collectivization. He believed that the Soviet Union needed to modernize quickly to compete with the capitalist West. Stalin's policies transformed the Soviet Union into an industrial and military powerhouse. However, these achievements came at a terrible human cost. Collectivization, the forced consolidation of individual peasant farms into collective farms, led to widespread famine and suffering. Millions of peasants died from starvation or were deported to labor camps. Stalin's reign of terror, known as the Great Purge, resulted in the deaths of millions of people. Anyone suspected of disloyalty to Stalin or the Communist Party was arrested, tortured, or executed. Despite the horrors of Stalinism, the Soviet Union under his rule underwent a remarkable transformation. It became a major industrial power capable of competing with the West. This newfound strength would prove crucial in the upcoming conflict that would engulf the world, World War II. Section 5. Superpower on the world stage. The Soviet Union in War and Peace. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 had profound consequences for the Soviet Union. Initially, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. This pact divided Eastern Europe between the two powers. However, the pact proved to be short-lived. In 1941, Hitler broke the agreement and launched a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was one of the most brutal campaigns in human history. The Soviet people endured unimaginable suffering during what they called the Great Patriotic War. Despite heavy losses, the Red Army, aided by Allied support, eventually pushed back the German invaders. The Soviet Union played a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. After the war, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower alongside the United States. The two countries, once allies against fascism, became locked in a bitter ideological and geopolitical rivalry known as the Cold War. This rivalry shaped international relations for decades and had a profound impact on global politics, economics, and culture. The Soviet Union exerted its influence over Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states and promoting communist ideology. As we delve deeper into the history of the Soviet Union, it is essential to understand the figures who shaped its early years and ideological foundations. Two names stand out above all others: Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Vladimir Lenin, born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870, emerged as the leader of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin was deeply influenced by the writings of Karl Marx and became a fervent advocate for revolution. Despite being exiled multiple times, his vision for a proletarian uprising never wavered. In 1917, amid the chaos of World War I and widespread discontent in Russia, Lenin saw his opportunity. He orchestrated the October Revolution, leading the Bolsheviks to seize power and establish the world's first socialist state. Lenin's policies and ideology laid the groundwork for the Soviet state. His new economic policy aimed to recover the war-torn economy by allowing limited private enterprise, a move that was both pragmatic and controversial. However, Lenin's health began to decline, and by 1924 he passed away, leaving a power vacuum. Enter Joseph Stalin, born Ioseb Vissarionis Dzyugashvili in 1878. Stalin, a shrewd and ruthless politician, maneuvered his way to the top of the Communist Party. By the late 1920s, he had outmaneuvered his rivals and consolidated power. Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union was starkly different from Lenin's. He launched a series of 5-year plans aimed at rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. While these policies transformed the Soviet Union into a major industrial power, they also led to widespread famine and suffering. Stalin's rule was marked by intense political repression, known as the Great Purge, where millions were executed or sent to labor camps. Despite the human cost, Stalin's policies and leadership were instrumental in preparing the Soviet Union for the challenges of World War II. The legacies of Lenin and Stalin are complex, filled with both achievements and atrocities. They were the architects of the Soviet Union, each leaving an indelible mark on history. Their lives and policies continue to be subjects of intense debate and study, shaping our understanding of the Soviet era and its impact on the world. To truly grasp the essence of the Soviet Union, one must delve into its ideological roots, primarily shaped by Marxism-Leninism. This ideology, a synthesis of Karl Marx's theories and Lenin's adaptations, served as the foundation for the Soviet state and its policies. Karl Marx, a 19th-century philosopher and economist, argued that history was driven by class struggle. He believed that the capitalist system, characterized by the exploitation of the working class by the bourgeoisie, would inevitably lead to a proletarian revolution. Marx envisioned a classless society where the means of production were communally owned, leading to the eventual withering away of the state. Lenin, however, recognized that Marx's theories needed adaptation to fit the realities of early 20th century Russia. Unlike the industrialized nations Marx had in mind, Russia was largely agrarian and underdeveloped. Lenin introduced the concept of a vanguard party, a tightly knit group of professional revolutionaries, to lead the proletarian revolution. He believed that this party was essential to guide the working class and peasants toward achieving a socialist state. Marxism-Leninism thus became the guiding doctrine of the Soviet Union. It emphasized the role of the Communist Party as the vanguard of the proletariat, leading the way to socialism through revolutionary means. Lenin's new economic policy, although a temporary retreat from pure socialism, was an example of pragmatic governance aimed at stabilizing the economy. Under Stalin, Marxism-Leninism took on a more rigid and authoritarian form. Stalin's interpretation emphasized centralized control, rapid industrialization, and collectivization. The state wielded immense power, and dissent was brutally suppressed. This period saw the implementation of 5-year plans and the Great Purge, reflecting Stalin's belief in the necessity of a strong, centralized authority to achieve socialist goals. The ideological foundations of the Soviet Union were thus a complex blend of Marxist theory and Leninist strategy, further shaped by Stalin's authoritarianism. These principles guided the Soviet state through its tumultuous history, influencing its domestic and foreign policies. While the ideology aimed at creating a classless, equitable society, its implementation often led to significant human suffering and political repression. Understanding Marxism-Leninism is crucial to comprehending the Soviet Union's actions and policies. It offers insight into the motivations behind the state's decisions and the profound impact of ideology on the lives of millions. The legacy of Marxism-Leninism continues to be a subject of study and debate, reflecting its enduring influence on global history. To understand the seismic shift brought about by the October Revolution, we must first examine the events that set the stage for this pivotal moment in history. The early 20th century was a period of immense turmoil and transformation for Russia, marked by social unrest, economic hardship, and political instability. The seeds of revolution were sown in the late 19th century, as the Russian Empire struggled to modernize. The vast majority of the population were peasants living in dire poverty, while the elite enjoyed immense wealth and power. The discontent among the working class and peasantry began to grow, fueled by harsh working conditions, low wages, and lack of political representation. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 further exacerbated the situation. Russia's humiliating defeat not only weakened the Tsarist regime, but also exposed the inefficiencies and corruption within the government and military. The war's end saw the rise of revolutionary fervor, culminating in the 1905 revolution. Although this revolution was ultimately suppressed, it forced Tsar Nicholas II to make concessions, including the creation of the State Duma, a legislative assembly. However, these reforms were too little, too late. World War I was the final catalyst for revolution. The war placed an unbearable strain on Russia's economy and society. Millions of soldiers were sent to the front lines where they faced appalling conditions and staggering casualties. On the home front, food and fuel shortages led to widespread hunger and discontent. The Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army further eroded his credibility, as military failures were now directly attributed to him. By February 1917, the situation reached a boiling point. Strikes and protests erupted in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, with workers demanding bread and an end to the war. The unrest quickly spread, and the Tsar's attempts to suppress it only fueled the flames. Soldiers began to mutiny, siding with the protesters, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The provisional government, which replaced the Tsarist regime, struggled to maintain order and address the pressing issues facing the nation. They chose to continue fighting in World War I, a deeply unpopular decision that further alienated them from the populace. Amid this chaos, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, saw an opportunity. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 marked a turning point. He rallied the Bolsheviks with his slogans of peace, land and bread, and all power to the Soviets, directly appealing to the war-weary soldiers, desperate peasants, and disillusioned workers. Throughout the summer and fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks gained support, particularly in key urban centers. By October, they were ready to seize power. On the night of October 25th, 26th, Julian calendar, or November 6th, 7, Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks launched a coup against the provisional government. The Winter Palace in Petrograd was stormed, and the government ministers were arrested. The October Revolution marked the beginning of a new era. The Bolsheviks, now in control, set about dismantling the old order and laying the foundations for the Soviet state. This momentous event not only transformed Russia, but also sent shockwaves around the world. inspiring revolutionary movements and altering the course of history. The road to the October Revolution was paved with struggle, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of change. It serves as a testament to the power of collective action and the profound impact of revolutionary ideology on the course of human events. The October Revolution may have marked the Bolsheviks' seizure of power, but it was the Russian Civil War that determined the fate of the nascent Soviet state. Central to this conflict was the Red Army, the military force established by the Bolsheviks to defend their revolutionary government against a myriad of adversaries. The Red Army was officially formed in January 1918, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, who was appointed as the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Trotsky faced the daunting task of transforming a disorganized and demoralized force into a disciplined and effective military machine. To achieve this, he implemented strict measures, including the conscription of former Tsarist officers who were coerced into service under the watchful eyes of politically loyal commissars. The Red Army's adversaries were diverse, including the White Army, composed of monarchists, conservatives, and other anti-Bolshevik factions. Additionally, the Red Army faced intervention from foreign powers such as Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, who sought to support the White forces and undermine the Bolshevik regime. The Civil War was brutal and chaotic, with shifting front lines and widespread atrocities committed by both sides. Despite these challenges, the Red Army managed to secure several key victories, thanks in part to their strategic use of railways for rapid troop movements and their ability to mobilize mass support among the peasantry and working class. One of the most significant battles was the defense of Petrograd in 1919. The White forces, led by General Yudenich, launched a major offensive to capture the Bolshevik stronghold. Trotsky personally took charge of the defense, rallying the Red Army and organizing a counteroffensive that ultimately repelled the White forces and secured the city. Another critical victory was the defeat of Admiral Kolchak's forces in Siberia. Kolchak, who had declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia, posed a significant threat to the Bolsheviks. However, the Red Army's superior organization and the harsh Siberian winter took their toll on Kolchak's troops, leading to their eventual collapse. The Red Army's success in the Civil War was not solely due to military prowess. The Bolsheviks also employed propaganda effectively, portraying the Red Army as the defenders of the revolution and the working class. This messaging resonated with many Russians who were disillusioned with the old regime and the chaos of the Civil War. By 1921, the Red Army had emerged victorious, securing Bolshevik control over most of the former Russian Empire. The Civil War had exacted a heavy toll with millions of casualties and widespread devastation. However, the Red Army's triumph ensured the survival of the Soviet state and laid the groundwork for the establishment of a centralized and authoritarian regime. The role of the Red Army in the Civil War was instrumental in shaping the early Soviet Union. It demonstrated the Bolsheviks' ability to mobilize and maintain power through both military force and ideological commitment. The legacy of the Red Army continued to influence Soviet military doctrine and the broader narrative of the Soviet state's origins. As we reflect on this period, it is clear that the Red Army's efforts during the Civil War were pivotal in determining the course of Russian history and the establishment of the Soviet Union as a global power. The Russian Civil War was not just a military conflict, it was also a battleground for competing economic ideologies. To survive the chaos and sustain the war effort, the Bolsheviks implemented a series of radical economic policies known as war communism. Introduced in 1918, war communism aimed to consolidate control over the economy and ensure the Red Army's needs were met. Key features included the nationalization of industry, compulsory grain requisitioning from peasants, and the abolition of private trade. While war communism succeeded in mobilizing resources for the war, it also led to widespread economic dislocation, severe shortages, and popular discontent. By 1921, Russia was in the grip of famine, and industrial production had plummeted to a fraction of its pre-war levels. The crisis necessitated a dramatic shift in economic policy. In response, Lenin introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP, in 1921, marking a temporary retreat from socialist principles in favor of pragmatic economic stabilization. The NEP reintroduced limited private enterprise, allowed peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market, and encouraged foreign investment. This mixed economy approach revitalized agricultural and industrial output, alleviating some of the hardships caused by war communism. The NEP was a controversial but necessary compromise, balancing ideological purity with economic reality. It demonstrated the Bolsheviks' willingness to adapt their strategies to ensure the survival and consolidation of the Soviet state. The lessons learned from this period would continue to inform Soviet economic policies in the decades to come. War, communism, and the NEP were not just economic measures, they were pivotal in shaping the early Soviet Union's approach to governance and state control. As we examine these policies, it becomes clear how the Soviet leadership navigated the complex interplay between ideology and practical necessity during a tumultuous era. The 1920s were a period of profound cultural and social transformation in the Soviet Union, a time when the new socialist state sought to reshape society in its own image. Following the tumultuous years of war communism and the introduction of the new economic policy, the Bolshevik leadership turned its attention to the realm of culture and everyday life. One of the most significant changes was the promotion of literacy and education. The Bolsheviks embarked on an ambitious campaign to eradicate illiteracy, establishing schools and adult education programs across the country. By the end of the decade, millions of Soviet citizens had learned to read and write, laying the foundation for a more informed and engaged populace. The arts, too, underwent a radical transformation. The Soviet government encouraged the creation of new forms of art that reflected socialist ideals. This period saw the rise of avant-garde movements in literature, theater, and visual arts. Writers like Vladimir Mayakovsky and filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein explored innovative techniques and themes, creating works that celebrated the revolution and the proletariat. Women's roles in society also began to shift dramatically. The Bolsheviks championed gender equality, implementing policies that aimed to liberate women from traditional roles. Women gained the right to vote, access to education, and opportunities for employment in various sectors. The Zhenotdel, a department dedicated to women's affairs, played a crucial role in advocating for women's rights and addressing their unique challenges. Meanwhile, the concept of the new Soviet man emerged, embodying the ideals of selflessness, collectivism, and dedication to the socialist cause. This ideal was promoted through propaganda and education, aiming to shape the character and values of Soviet citizens. However, these changes were not without their challenges. Traditional beliefs and customs often clashed with the new socialist ideals, leading to tensions and resistance in various parts of the country. The push for rapid cultural transformation sometimes resulted in dislocation and confusion as people struggled to adapt to the new norms. The 1920s were a decade of experimentation and aspiration, as the Soviet Union sought to build a new society from the ground up. The cultural and social changes of this period laid the groundwork for the future development of Soviet identity and left a lasting impact on the nation's history. As we delve into the cultural and social landscape of the 1920s, we can appreciate the complexities and contradictions of this transformative era, understanding how the Soviet Union endeavored to create a new world in the aftermath of revolution and civil war. With the cultural and social landscape of the 1920s setting the stage for a new Soviet identity, the political arena was about to undergo a seismic shift. The death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924 left a power vacuum at the top of the Communist Party, igniting a fierce struggle for leadership. At the heart of this struggle were two towering figures, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, a brilliant orator and the architect of the Red Army, seemed the natural successor. However, Stalin, the shrewd and calculating general secretary, had been quietly amassing power behind the scenes. Stalin's rise was marked by his ability to outmaneuver his rivals. He strategically positioned his allies within the party and used his control over party appointments to consolidate his influence. Trotsky, despite his intellectual prowess and military achievements, found himself increasingly isolated. The ideological battle between the two was stark. Trotsky advocated for permanent revolution, believing that the success of socialism depended on its spread beyond the Soviet Union. Stalin, on the other hand, championed socialism in one country, focusing on strengthening the Soviet state internally before exporting the revolution. By 1927, Stalin had effectively sidelined Trotsky, who was expelled from the Communist Party and later exiled from the Soviet Union. With Trotsky out of the picture, Stalin turned his attention to other potential rivals, systematically eliminating them through a combination of political maneuvering, purges, and show trials. Stalin's consolidation of power culminated in the Great Purge of the late 1930s, a campaign of political repression that saw the execution and imprisonment of hundreds of thousands, including many of the original Bolshevik revolutionaries. This period of terror solidified Stalin's absolute control over the Soviet Union. As Stalin established his dictatorship, he embarked on ambitious policies of industrialization and collectivization, fundamentally transforming Soviet society. However, these policies came at a tremendous human cost, with widespread famine, forced labor, and mass executions becoming grim hallmarks of his rule. The power struggle after Lenin's death and Stalin's subsequent rise to power marked a pivotal chapter in Soviet history. It was a time of intense political intrigue and ruthless ambition, setting the stage for the totalitarian regime that would dominate the Soviet Union for decades to come. In examining this turbulent period, we gain insight into the complex and often brutal dynamics that shaped the Soviet state, understanding how Stalin's ascent to power left an indelible mark on the course of history. With Stalin firmly in control of the Soviet Union, the late 1920s and 1930s saw the launch of one of the most ambitious economic programs in history, the Five-Year Plans. These plans aimed to rapidly transform the Soviet Union from a predominantly agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. The first five-year plan, introduced in 1928, focused on heavy industry, transportation, and the collectivization of agriculture. Stalin's vision was clear. The Soviet Union needed to catch up with the Western industrial powers, and it needed to do so quickly. This meant prioritizing the production of steel, coal, and machinery, while also modernizing the agricultural sector to support the growing urban workforce. Collectivization was a cornerstone of this plan. Millions of small, privately owned farms were consolidated into large, state-controlled collective farms. The goal was to increase agricultural productivity through mechanization and centralized planning. However, this policy met with fierce resistance from many peasants, leading to widespread unrest and a devastating famine, particularly in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. Despite these human costs, the first five-year plan achieved significant industrial growth. Soviet factories produced more steel, coal, and electricity than ever before, laying the foundation for future economic development. The success of the first plan, at least in terms of industrial output, encouraged Stalin to continue with subsequent plans. The second five-year plan, launched in 1933, aimed to build on the achievements of the first. It focused on further expanding heavy industry and improving infrastructure, including the construction of new railways and the development of the oil and chemical industries. This period also saw the establishment of several showpiece projects, such as the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Moscow Metro, designed to showcase the Soviet Union's technological and engineering prowess. However, the relentless push for industrialization came at a severe human cost. Forced labor, harsh working conditions, and unrealistic production quotas led to widespread suffering. Millions of people, including political prisoners and those deemed enemies of the state, were sent to labor camps, known as gulags, where they toiled under brutal conditions. The third five-year plan, which began in 1938, was interrupted by the outbreak of World War II. Nonetheless, the industrial base built during the earlier plans played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's ability to withstand and eventually repel the Nazi invasion. Stalin's five-year plans were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they succeeded in transforming the Soviet Union into a major industrial power capable of competing with the West. On the other hand, they inflicted immense suffering on the Soviet people, with millions losing their lives due to famine, forced labor, and political repression. In examining the five-year plans and the push for rapid industrialization, we see a complex and often harsh chapter in Soviet history. It was a time of great ambition and profound human cost, reflecting the broader tensions and contradictions of Stalin's rule. The legacy of this period continues to shape our understanding of the Soviet Union and its place in the 20th century. As the Soviet Union marched forward with its ambitious five-year plans, another dark chapter unfolded under Stalin's rule, the Great Purge. Also known as the Great Terror, this period from 1936 to 1938 saw a massive campaign of political repression, characterized by widespread arrests, executions, and a climate of fear that permeated every layer of Soviet society. The Great Purge was initiated by Stalin to eliminate any potential threats to his absolute power. Paranoia and suspicion ran rampant as Stalin believed that enemies lurked within the Communist Party, the military, and even among ordinary citizens. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, became the instrument of this terror, carrying out Stalin's orders with ruthless efficiency. Prominent figures within the Communist Party, including high-ranking officials, were accused of treason, espionage, and other fabricated crimes. Show trials were held to publicly disgrace and eliminate these individuals. Many were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit under intense torture and psychological pressure. The most infamous of these trials were the Moscow trials, where key Bolshevik leaders were condemned to death. But the purge did not stop with the political elite. It extended to the military, where a significant number of officers were arrested and executed. This decimation of the Red Army's leadership had dire consequences, weakening the Soviet military just as it was about to face the threat of Nazi Germany. The purges also reached deep into the fabric of Soviet society. Intellectuals, artists, scientists, and ordinary citizens were not spared. People lived in constant fear of being denounced by neighbors, colleagues, or even family members. The mere suspicion of disloyalty could result in arrest, imprisonment, or execution. The Gulag system expanded as millions were sent to labor camps, where they endured inhumane conditions and backbreaking work. These camps became a symbol of the pervasive repression and brutality of Stalin's regime. The impact of the Great Purge on Soviet society was profound and far-reaching. It created a culture of fear and mistrust that stifled creativity, innovation, and dissent. The loss of countless lives and the destruction of intellectual and military talent left a deep scar on the nation's psyche. Stalin's Great Purge serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of political paranoia. It was a period of immense suffering and loss, but it also revealed the resilience of the human spirit in the face of tyranny. As we reflect on the Great Purge and its impact, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities and contradictions of Stalin's rule. It was a time when the Soviet Union achieved remarkable feats of industrialization and modernization, yet paid an incalculable human cost. The legacy of this dark chapter continues to shape our understanding of Soviet history and the enduring struggle for justice and human rights. As the Soviet Union navigated through the turbulent waters of industrialization and political repression, the role of propaganda and censorship became ever more crucial in maintaining the state's control over its citizens. Propaganda served as a powerful tool to shape public perception and promote the ideals of the Communist Party, while censorship ensured that dissenting voices were systematically silenced. Propaganda in the Soviet Union was omnipresent, infiltrating every aspect of daily life. From posters glorifying the achievements of the state, to films and literature that extolled the virtues of socialism, the Soviet regime meticulously crafted a narrative that highlighted the successes of the Communist Party and the supposed superiority of the socialist system. The most iconic symbol of Soviet propaganda was the image of the worker hero, tirelessly laboring for the greater good of society. This idealized figure was meant to inspire citizens to contribute to the collective effort of building a socialist utopia. The media played a central role in disseminating propaganda. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and later television programs were tightly controlled by the state. Only content that aligned with the party's ideology was allowed to reach the public. The state-run newspaper Pravda, meaning truth, became the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, delivering carefully curated news and information that reinforced the party's narrative. Censorship, on the other hand, was the mechanism through which the Soviet regime suppressed any form of dissent or criticism. The Glavlit, the main censorship agency, had the authority to review and approve all publications, ensuring that only content favorable to the state was published. Books, articles, and even scientific research were subject to rigorous scrutiny. Works deemed counter-revolutionary or ideologically subversive were banned, and their authors often faced severe repercussions. The arts were not immune to the reach of censorship. Writers, artists, and musicians were expected to conform to the principles of socialist realism, a style that depicted the Soviet Union in a positive light and glorified the achievements of socialism. Those who deviated from this prescribed style risked persecution. Many renowned artists and intellectuals found themselves silenced, imprisoned, or exiled for their refusal to adhere to the party line. Education was another critical avenue for propaganda. Schools and universities were tasked with instilling the values of Marxism-Leninism in the younger generation. History was rewritten to fit the party's narrative, with inconvenient truths omitted or distorted. The portrayal of historical figures was carefully managed to ensure that they aligned with the current political agenda. The impact of propaganda and censorship on Soviet society was profound. It created an environment where independent thought was stifled and conformity was enforced. The relentless promotion of the party's ideology left little room for critical thinking or dissent. Citizens were constantly bombarded with messages that reinforced the state's narrative, shaping their perceptions and beliefs. Yet, despite the pervasive nature of propaganda and censorship, there were those who resisted. Underground movements and dissident groups emerged, challenging the state's control over information and expression. These brave individuals risked their lives to speak out against the regime, leaving a legacy of defiance and resilience. In reflecting on the role of propaganda and censorship in the Soviet Union, we gain insight into the ways in which authoritarian regimes manipulate information to maintain power. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of freedom of expression and the need to safeguard against the erosion of democratic principles. The lessons learned from this period continue to resonate, highlighting the enduring struggle for truth and the right to free speech. As the Soviet Union emerged from the chaos of revolution and civil war, it faced a world that was largely hostile to its existence. The interwar period, spanning from the end of World War I in 1918 to the beginning of World War II in 1939, was a time of significant diplomatic maneuvering for the Soviet state. Initially, the Soviet Union was isolated on the international stage. The Western powers, wary of the spread of communism, refused to recognize the new Bolshevik government. This diplomatic isolation was compounded by the fact that the Soviet Union was dealing with internal strife and economic hardship. However, the Soviets were determined to break this isolation and secure their position in the global arena. One of the key strategies employed by the Soviet Union during this period was the pursuit of diplomatic recognition. The Soviet government sought to establish formal relations with other nations, both to legitimize its regime and to facilitate trade and economic recovery. This effort began to bear fruit in the mid-1920s, as countries like Germany and the United Kingdom extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. The Treaty of Rapallo, signed in 1922 between Germany and the Soviet Union, was a landmark agreement that marked the beginning of Soviet diplomatic breakthroughs. The treaty normalized relations between the two nations and included economic and military cooperation clauses. This alliance was particularly significant, as it allowed the Soviet Union to circumvent the restrictions imposed by the Western powers and gain access to much-needed industrial technology and expertise. The Soviet Union also sought to promote communist revolutions abroad through the Comintern or Communist International. Established in 1919, the Comintern aimed to unite communist parties around the world and support revolutionary movements. However, the success of these efforts was limited, as many communist uprisings were suppressed, and the Soviet Union had to navigate the delicate balance between supporting global revolution and maintaining diplomatic relations. In the 1930s, the rise of fascism in Europe posed a new threat to the Soviet Union. The aggressive expansionist policies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were a cause for concern. In response, the Soviet Union began to seek alliances with Western democracies, despite their ideological differences. This shift in foreign policy was evident in the Soviet Union's participation in the League of Nations and its support for collective security measures. The signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in 1939 was a controversial and pragmatic decision by the Soviet leadership. The pact, which included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowed the Soviet Union to buy time to strengthen its defenses against a potential German invasion. While the pact temporarily averted conflict with Germany, it also led to the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland and Romania, actions that would have lasting repercussions. Throughout the interwar period, the Soviet Union's foreign policy was characterized by a combination of pragmatism and ideological commitment. The Soviet leadership navigated a complex and often hostile international landscape, seeking to secure the state's survival and advance the cause of socialism. This period laid the groundwork for the Soviet Union's later role as a major player on the global stage during World War II and the ensuing Cold War. In analyzing the Soviet Union's foreign policy during the interwar period, we see a nation striving to assert its place in the world while grappling with internal and external challenges. the lessons learned from this era continue to inform our understanding of international relations and the dynamics of power and ideology. As the world plunged into the chaos of World War II, the Soviet Union found itself at the heart of one of the most brutal and transformative conflicts in human history. The war began for the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion that caught the Soviets largely by surprise. The early days of the invasion were disastrous for the Soviet Union. The German Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories and inflicting heavy casualties. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk and Kiev fell swiftly, and the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow by late 1941. The Soviet response was marked by heroic resistance, exemplified by the defense of Leningrad and the Battle of Moscow. Despite initial setbacks, the Soviet Union managed to halt the German advance with a combination of fierce fighting, harsh winter conditions, and strategic counteroffensives. The turning point came in 1942 to 1943 with the Battle of Stalingrad. This brutal and grueling battle, fought over several months, saw the Soviet forces encircle and eventually defeat the German Sixth Army. Stalingrad was a devastating blow to Nazi Germany, and marked the beginning of a Soviet counteroffensive that would push the Germans back across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union's war effort was characterized by immense sacrifice and resilience. The Red Army, bolstered by massive industrial production and logistical support, launched a series of offensives that liberated occupied territories. The siege of Leningrad was finally lifted in January 1944 after nearly 900 days of suffering and starvation. The Soviet advance continued through Ukraine, Belarus, and into the Balkans. The final push into Germany began in 1945. The Red Army, now a formidable force, advanced towards Berlin from the east. The Battle of Berlin, a brutal and decisive confrontation, culminated in the capture of the German capital in May 1945. The fall of Berlin signaled the end of the war in Europe and the total defeat of Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as one of the victorious Allied powers, but the cost was staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviets, both military and civilian, perished in the conflict. The war left vast swaths of the Soviet Union in ruins, with cities destroyed and infrastructure devastated. However, the victory solidified the Soviet Union's status as a superpower and set the stage for its dominance in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. The legacy of World War II continues to shape the memory and identity of the Soviet Union and later Russia. The immense sacrifices and heroic struggles of the Soviet people are remembered and honored, while the geopolitical consequences of the war continue to influence international relations to this day. In examining the Soviet Union's role in World War II, we witness a story of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph. The war not only reshaped the Soviet Union, but also had profound implications for the global order in the latter half of the 20th century. The conclusion of World War II marked a turning point for the Soviet Union, both in terms of its global standing and the profound impact on its people. The immense sacrifices made during the conflict left deep scars on the nation's psyche and landscape. With an estimated 27 million lives lost, nearly every Soviet family was touched by the tragedy of war. The human cost was staggering, and the physical devastation was equally immense. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, and the agricultural heartlands were ravaged. Yet, amid this destruction, the Soviet Union found itself elevated to the status of a superpower. The Red Army's role in defeating Nazi Germany had earned the Soviet Union a seat at the table of global power, setting the stage for its dominance in Eastern Europe and the onset of the Cold War. Reconstruction became the immediate focus. The Soviet government launched massive efforts to rebuild cities, factories, and infrastructure. The war had demonstrated the effectiveness of centralized planning and mobilization, and these principles were applied with renewed vigor in the post-war period. However, the emphasis on heavy industry often came at the expense of consumer goods and living standards, leading to continued hardship for many Soviet citizens. The war also left an indelible mark on Soviet culture and memory. The heroism of the Red Army and the sacrifices of ordinary citizens were glorified in films, literature, and public commemorations. Victory Day, celebrated on May 9th, became one of the most important holidays in the Soviet calendar, a day of remembrance and national pride. However, the war's legacy was not without its darker aspects. The immense strain of the conflict had exacerbated existing political repression. The post-war period saw the continuation of Stalin's purges and the suppression of dissent. The trauma of the war years, coupled with the harsh realities of Reconstruction, created a society marked by resilience, but also by fear and conformity. The geopolitical landscape had also shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union's influence now extended across Eastern Europe, where it established a series of satellite states. This expansion set the stage for the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry with the United States and its allies. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism would shape global politics for decades to come. In the end, the impact of World War II on the Soviet Union was profound and multifaceted. It was a story of immense sacrifice and suffering, but also of resilience and triumph. The war reshaped the Soviet Union, both in terms of its internal dynamics and its role on the world stage. The legacy of this period continues to influence the memory and identity of the former Soviet states, serving as a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The conclusion of World War II did not bring lasting peace to the world. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. The Soviet Union, having emerged as a superpower, found itself locked in a geopolitical and ideological struggle with the United States and its allies. This period, spanning from the late 1940s to the early 1990s, was characterized by a tense standoff that shaped global politics and had far-reaching consequences. The Cold War was not a traditional war fought on battlefields but a complex and multifaceted conflict involving espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. The Soviet Union sought to expand its influence and promote its communist ideology, while the United States aimed to contain the spread of communism and uphold democratic values. This ideological battle played out in various arenas, from Europe to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. One of the earliest and most significant confrontations of the Cold War was the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949. In an attempt to force the Western Allies out of Berlin, the Soviet Union blocked all ground access to the city. In response, the Western Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city by air for almost a year. This event highlighted the deep divisions between East and West and set the tone for the Cold War. The Cold War also saw the formation of military alliances. In 1949, the United States and its Western European allies established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a collective defense pact. In response, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. These alliances solidified the division of Europe into two opposing blocs. The nuclear arms race was another defining feature of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union amassed vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, leading to a precarious balance of power known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. This doctrine held that any nuclear attack by one superpower would result in a devastating retaliatory strike, effectively deterring both sides from initiating a nuclear conflict. The Cold War also fueled numerous proxy wars, where the superpowers supported opposing sides in regional conflicts. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet-Afghan War are notable examples. These conflicts were often brutal and had significant impacts on the countries involved, while also contributing to the global tension between the superpowers. The space race was another arena of Cold War competition. The Soviet Union achieved early successes with the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, and the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. These achievements were sources of immense national pride and demonstrated the Soviet Union's technological capabilities. However, the United States eventually took the lead with the Apollo moon landings, marking a significant victory in the space race. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained a strict regime of political repression and censorship. The KGB, the Soviet secret police, played a crucial role in suppressing dissent and maintaining control. Despite this, there were moments of resistance and calls for reform, such as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968. These uprisings were brutally crushed by Soviet forces, reinforcing the regime's grip on power. The Cold War finally began to thaw in the late 1980s with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev introduced policies of Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, restructuring, aimed at reforming the Soviet system and reducing tensions with the West. These reforms, coupled with a series of negotiations and arms reduction treaties, eventually led to the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the definitive end of the Cold War. The dissolution of the USSR brought an end to the ideological conflict that had dominated global politics for nearly half a century. The legacy of the Cold War continues to shape international relations and the political landscape of the former Soviet states. In conclusion, the Cold War was a period of intense rivalry and profound global impact. The Soviet Union's role in this conflict was central, shaping its foreign policy and internal dynamics. The Cold War left an indelible mark on the world, influencing the course of history and the development of modern geopolitics. As the Cold War raged on, the Soviet Union entered a period known as the Brezhnev era, named after Leonid Brezhnev, who led the country from 1964 to 1982. This period is often characterized by economic stagnation and political conservatism, which had profound effects on the Soviet Union's trajectory. Under Brezhnev's leadership, the Soviet Union initially experienced a sense of stability and continuity. However, this stability came at a cost. The economic model that had driven rapid industrial growth in earlier decades began to falter. Centralized planning and heavy industry were no longer sufficient to meet the needs of a modern, diversified economy. Agricultural production lagged, consumer goods were in short supply, and technological innovation was stifled. The term "era of stagnation" aptly describes this period, as economic growth slowed to a crawl. The Soviet leadership was reluctant to implement significant reforms, fearing that change might undermine their control. Instead, they continued to rely on the same policies that had worked in the past, leading to inefficiency and waste. Politically, the Brezhnev era was marked by a return to strict authoritarianism. The government cracked down on dissent, tightened censorship, and maintained a rigid control over the populace. The KGB, the Soviet secret police, played a crucial role in suppressing any form of opposition, ensuring that the status quo remained unchallenged. One of the most visible signs of stagnation was the aging leadership. The Soviet Politburo, the highest decision-making body, became increasingly geriatric, with many members remaining in power well into their old age. This lack of fresh ideas and dynamic leadership further contributed to the country's malaise. Internationally, the Brezhnev Doctrine asserted the Soviet Union's right to intervene in the affairs of socialist countries to preserve communist rule. This doctrine was put into practice during the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, when Soviet troops crushed the Prague Spring, a movement for political liberalization. Despite the outward appearance of stability, the underlying issues of the Brezhnev era set the stage for future crises. The lack of economic reform and political openness created a brittle system that was ill-prepared to handle the challenges of the coming decades. In summary, the Brezhnev era was a time of economic and political stagnation that ultimately weakened the Soviet Union. The reluctance to embrace change and the emphasis on maintaining control led to a period of decline that would have lasting consequences for the country and its people. As the Soviet Union entered the 1980s, the need for change became increasingly apparent. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985 with a vision to revitalize the ailing superpower. Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms that would ultimately reshape the Soviet Union and lead to its dissolution. One of Gorbachev's key initiatives was, or restructuring. This policy aimed to overhaul the stagnant Soviet economy by introducing elements of market economics. Gorbachev allowed for the creation of small private businesses and reduced the state's grip on the economy. While these changes were intended to boost productivity and innovation, they also led to economic instability and shortages, as the old system struggled to adapt to new practices. Alongside perestroika, Gorbachev implemented meaning openness. This policy aimed to increase transparency in government institutions and promote freedom of information. For the first time, Soviet citizens could openly criticize the government and discuss previously taboo subjects. Glasnost led to a surge in public discourse and revealed the extent of corruption and inefficiency within the Soviet system. However, these reforms also had unintended consequences. The newfound freedom of expression fueled nationalist movements within the Soviet republics. Calls for independence grew louder in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and other regions, challenging the very fabric of the Soviet Union. Internationally, Gorbachev sought to reduce Cold War tensions through and disarmament. He engaged in negotiations with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, leading to significant arms reduction agreements like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. These efforts earned Gorbachev the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, but they did little to address the internal crises facing the Soviet Union. By 1991, the situation had reached a breaking point. The economy was in freefall and political unrest was rampant. In August, a failed coup by hardline communists attempted to overthrow Gorbachev, but it only hastened the collapse. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure in thwarting the coup and subsequently became a symbol of the new Russia. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, declaring the office extinct. The Soviet flag was lowered for the last time, and the Russian tricolor was hoisted in its place. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics formally ceased to exist, marking the end of an era. In conclusion, Gorbachev's reforms of Perestroika and Glasnost were bold attempts to modernize the Soviet Union but ultimately accelerated its downfall. The collapse of the Soviet Union not only reshaped the geopolitical landscape but also had profound implications for millions of people who had lived under its rule. As the Soviet Union dissolved, a new chapter in world history began. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex and multifaceted, leaving an indelible mark on global politics, economics, and culture. The Soviet Union's ambitious social and economic experiments, while often fraught with hardship and controversy, laid the groundwork for modernization in many parts of the world. The emphasis on industrialization and education contributed to significant technological and scientific advancements, including the space race that culminated in Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human to journey into outer space. On the international stage, the Soviet Union played a pivotal role in shaping the 20th century. Its rivalry with the United States during the Cold War defined global geopolitics for decades, influencing everything from military strategies to cultural exchanges. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism spurred numerous proxy wars and left a lasting impact on countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Soviet Union also left a profound legacy within its former republics. The transition from a centrally planned economy to market-based systems was tumultuous, leading to economic instability and social upheaval. Yet these nations have also experienced newfound freedoms and opportunities for democratic governance. Culturally, the Soviet Union produced a wealth of artistic and intellectual achievements. From the literature of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky to the films of Eisenstein and Tarkovsky, Soviet cultural contributions continue to be celebrated worldwide. The Soviet Union's emphasis on collective identity and social welfare has also left a lasting imprint on contemporary discussions about social justice and economic equality. However, the legacy of the Soviet Union is not without its darker chapters. The regime's authoritarian nature, marked by political repression, censorship, and human rights abuses, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of totalitarianism. The memories of the Great Purge, the Gulag system, and the suppression of dissent remain stark reminders of the human cost of political ideologies. In the modern world, the echoes of the Soviet Union can still be felt. Russia, as the largest successor state, continues to grapple with its Soviet past while asserting itself as a major global player. The geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia remains deeply influenced by the Soviet legacy, with ongoing conflicts and alliances tracing their roots back to this era. As we reflect on the Soviet Union's legacy, it is clear that its impact is far-reaching and enduring. The lessons learned from its rise and fall continue to shape our understanding of governance, economics, and human rights. Understanding this complex history is crucial as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Until next time, stay curious.